Hello and welcome to revision tips for SIPS Level 6 Professional Diploma in Procurement and Supply. This is Module 9, Supply Network Design, and it's Learning Outcome 3, which is to assess the strategic value of resource planning and control. So we're going to investigate what the principles and tools of strategic resource planning, management and control bring to planning the operation and success of supply network design. So every organisation needs to control their resources in some way, and that could be stock, premises, equipment, staff and supplies. So the strategic resource planning is required in order to meet strategic objectives, like the quality, speed, dependability and flexibility and the cost performance. So operation strategy will normally be based about the intended capacity or capability. So the important questions that you might want to think about should include what capacity, capability and resources are required, and when will they be required, how will they be made available, and where should they be located. So who should be the provider, the owner or responsible party for each resource? Suppliers and their supply chain should be considered as a resource. The supply chain network should be evaluated to establish whether or not resources are effective and can support the organisation. The requirements for strategic resource planning depend on the strategy, and organisations may be led or dominated by strategy first, which efforts then made to create a resource to meet that requirement at a larger and later activity. In other cases, the organisation may create the strategy to fit its resources, capability and limitations. So some organisations may follow an emergent strategy principle where little advantage takes place and the organisation reacts to the performance and market changes. This approach may limit their ability to create effective strategic change as a result of resource constraints. Now, some organisations may be led or dominated by that strategy first, as I said, and the efforts made to create a resource to meet that requirement. But others create that strategy to fit its resource capability now and in the future, or those limitations known now or realistically assessed for the future. So others may establish a generic strategy, a specific strategy, or some strategic objectives. But general strategies deal with how an organisation competes or the nature of the service offered. Now, Porter created an overview of how organisations can achieve competitive advantage by either becoming the lowest cost producer, and that can be achieved by establishing long-term, low-cost sources of materials and products, or using a low-cost premises, or even using automation to eliminate any high labour costs. Also, you could look at becoming an organisation that is meaningfully different to its competitors by providing immediate stock compared to competitors that require a lead time, or even differentiating designed products, offering demonstrably better customer service, or supplementary products or services. Then becoming a specialist focused on niche provider is another strategy you could pursue. Now, Porter suggested the focus strategy could be based on either low cost or differentiation, where you specialised in one type of product or service, used one specific technology, be a resource source of reference or excellence to a chosen specialism, and each generic strategy will involve a procurement person required to consider the resource requirements and ensure they can be put in place at the appropriate time. An appropriate supply network for undertaking network changes to achieve the desired strategy will also need to be put together. Now, in order to establish strategic views of resources, This is an overview of common approaches and themes of the major resource elements already identified. So premises can be a high-cost element and can have significant impact on its operation. The size, the type and location should be established as appropriate to the known needs or suitably, but that can change as the organisation and the environments change. So you've obviously got the options of buying premises, leasing premises, renting premises, but the location is also critical, and having multiple premises could offer you a significant advantage, or having different premises with different costs, or ones for seasonal or short-term requirements. And then the stock, different organisations have different approaches to stock, whether the stock is a raw material, part processed material, components or finished goods. So you've got to establish a strategy to minimise stock, while others use immediately available stock as a means of strategic advantage. And you could have different classifications of stock, like everyday supplies, buying group items, regular sellers, available to order or special orders. But stocking decisions on a strategic basis are easier when you've got stable or predictable patterns of demand, lead times, good communication. And they're likely to change if a competitor activity changes or the nature of product or service does. Raw materials are unavailable. And you often classify your stock to help to identify different features. And it could be annual, monthly, weekly, volumes used, percentages, value, lead times, whether you've got a sole supplier or a dual or multi-supply. A commitment to barcoding technology and radio frequency ID are heavily linked to stock control, although these may similarly be considered as part of the equipment or storage strategy or technology. So moving on to plant and equipment, you need investment in plant and equipment and machinery. And that's obviously included in strategic resource planning. Some might need specific equipment types that are more cost effective, that produce a superior result. So you need to plan the appropriate equipment, whether that be a purchase, lease, rental. The purchase of the equipment will use cash or involve a loan. But the ownership of equipment allows the freedom to sell or recover funds at a later date. But leasing has a lower cash investment, but regular payments. And hiring could be an effective way to meet requirements for low usage for short periods of time. The technology or IT infrastructure is subject to continual development. And that strategic review is required to supplement well-managed operational routines. Your IT requirements tend to be limited by the technology selected, or the software, or the hardware, or the functionality. And you often find yourself in a problem with legacy systems. And in some cases, because the existing infrastructure works, there could be a resistance to undertake significant changes with the IT performance. In terms of human resources, there are several ways in which human resources may be viewed strategically. With an organisation, a recruitment of staff could be met by direct employment on a full-time permanent basis, part-time permanent, fixed-term contract, variable hours, temporary basis, or the reallocation of staff from under-capacity roles, combining staff or multi-skilling their staff to prevent skill gaps. But the needs could also be addressed by using a shared service with other parts of the organisation, using agency staff, using a service provider to supply its own staff to the work of an organisation, outsourcing or automating. But obviously each of these options have got their own advantages and disadvantages and may have contractual legal implications for consideration. Now, finance should be reviewed as a strategic resource. The key theme for most organisations will include cost control and income generation, which contributes to profitability. cash control, which may limit daily operational capacity, prioritisation of spending as some costs are more critical than others, and the sources of finance which have different costs, advantages and disadvantages. Now, some organisations require an effective research and development resource in order to compete. And in the case of some pharmaceutical businesses, successful research and development allows a business to develop new products. Research and development can be achieved by a variety of means. For example, by takeover or merger of recruitment of new staff, development internally, collaboration with individuals with specific expertise, licenses to use intellectual property, or outsourcing part of your R&D. And then finally, suppliers. Suppliers are valuable resources in a supply network. The use of specific suppliers can make a significant difference to the performance of your business, and the reliance of outsourced activities in some industries means that a poorly performing customer can be dissatisfied. So it is important that a business has a clear view of its supply network. You need to analyse and understand the relative strengths and weaknesses of your suppliers and prioritise order placement to seek to replace ineffective suppliers. Now, evaluating resources may occur when strategic planning is taking place, periodically in order to ensure resource plans are appropriate and adequate, or when appropriate operational performance suggests that the expected outcome may not be achieved. So on the screen, you're seeing the current strategic performance and the future strategic performance. So these type of diagrams can help to support strategic resource decisions. You may often develop preferred solutions as part of your resource view, and it can aid the speed of decisions to ensure consistency, but some specific issues relating to resources could be overlooked. It can also be possible that some creative ideas are not considered if standard decisions dominate the decision making. So the one on the left, this type of diagram intended for use in tracking the current capability against the current strategic importance. And similar matrices can be prepared to act as a guide for specific resources, which may be more tailored to each resource. But the one on the right is a type of matrix designed to aid ideas generation when dealing with the resource of the organisation against its new strategic importance. So the high current capability, low future importance box is perhaps the most difficult to deal or accept. A fast speed of change requirements place challenges on all of the resources. Now, customer expectations can be created from a variety of sources. You've got the power and importance of the customer and supplier, relationship history, previous experience, supplier promises, contract contents, and other supplier performances. Now, some of these are outside the control of the supplier, but some sources can be directly influenced. And it may be possible for an organisation to meet the customer expectations entirely from standard operations and resources, or meet the customer expectation entirely by changing standard operations and resources. You can offer the customer its standard performance using standard operations and planned resources and managing customer expectations. But you should not contract to meet a customer performance expectation unless it's considered the operational implications, and there could even be legal consequences if commitments are not delivered. Unrealistic customer expectations need to be addressed. Customer expectations can be managed by providing regular updates and requesting information relating to customer plans and any changes in performance that may be required. But expectations can be managed by the open reporting of key performance indicators or service level agreements, whether or not these form part of the contractual obligations. Now, customer expectations may also be driven by perceptions rather than facts. And that could be based on previous instance of dealing with different industries, but expecting a similar performance from its suppliers. The network members need to understand the expectations and perceptions which can adversely affect a relationship. So we're now going to look at some of the other factors. We'll start with forecasting. That is the ability to forecast and relative accuracy of forecasting, which affects resource planning. It obviously relies on projections of activities expected for a given period, like the analysis of data, intended requirements, opinions from customers and staff, and any expert systems that use complex algorithms. The second is capacity, and establishing your capacity limitations are essential to resource planning. Similarly, some organisations may set capacity usage requirements in order to ensure an appropriate level of productivity is being achieved. Capacity commitments may also be part of this supply agreement, whether they are utilised or not. Now, machinery will probably be designed with capacity limitations. Staff might have specific targets for some of or all of their activities. And then you've got the logistics, including the storage and distributions, which also have capacity plans. The third one is the resources, and resources available to plan the operations of an organisation will influence the ability to plan. In many cases, experience of the operations is necessary and collaboration across the functions in an organisation is required. So the time taken to complete a planning activity can only be estimated if the staff used have the same capability and the same task. Moving on to priorities, an established priority will guide the planning process and in some cases may restrict some other activities. It might result in operating in a less efficient or less effective way. So if a manufacturing facility requires to prioritise a specific customer work, this may be for a relatively small volume, but the prioritisation delays other customers' works and involves a greater amount of setting up time for the machine rather than working to a production schedule for the same items. So prioritising often results in compromises, but the rationale for the priority should mean that the right result for the organisation has been achieved. Some organisations and operations will require a series of stages that require scheduling. And this technique is also seen in project management. Planning of resources is influenced by the pattern of work needed to maintain and the intended completion date. And we see things like Gantt charts and time planners that support the type of planning. You can even use software to monitor progress and create reports to identify resource requirements and costs. Monitoring requires some degree of allocating staff to monitor those operations. But it's often the case that individual staff responsible for specific work will also actively monitor the progress and report any delays or changes required. The method of frequency of monitoring should be considered when creating plans. Different methods may involve more time and more people, or result in greater or less accuracy. And then moving on to control. The control of resources and the controlled planning of resources is implicit in organisations. But in practice, it can sometimes be difficult to exercise full control, particularly when there may be individual decision-making that could contradict or conflict with the plans that you've made. So control techniques are often expected as part of the management practice, and you've got that kind of typical plan, do, check, act kind of approach. And this pattern is widely seen in the SIPS textbooks, but it always has a different context. But decisions are required for the extent of monitoring, control, and periodic intervention. And that's often based on the importance of the plan and the risk of it not being achieved. Now, information and data gathering are essential to aid effective resource planning. It's useful to first review the data and information in terms of information management theory. Now, data is regarded as raw materials or information, and this should mean that it's not been subject to manipulation or interpretation. So data is its purest form, it's raw, and it's sometimes subject to cleansing or correction to remove anything irrelevant or duplicative, or it also subject to mining. And then information is described as the presentation of that data with a meaning or a purpose. But information management theory includes many principles of good information, and the expectations are that the data should be accurate based on accurate data, reliable, so it's verifiable from a valid source. It needs to be timely and appropriate to the period that you're looking at or the timescales for your decision making. Relevant and suitable to the user's requirements and decision making, and complete, providing all the information needed to support the user's decision process. And many organisations create standard methods of presenting information. The templates for information presentation and comparisons of comparative performance help to maintain that sort of consistency and aid tracking over the longer period. And what you can see on the right-hand side is infographics, which is a presentation of data and information in a graphical form. And although this includes conventional graphs, the intention is to provide high visual impacts. And we are seeing an increasing adoption of infographics to create a strong visual representation and emphasize comparisons of trends. Now, effective management requires appropriate planning, decisions, implementation, and control measures. And now we're looking at the sort of focus on specific techniques and routines. So there are many common aspects which features planning and subsequent controls when you're managing resources. So you've got process control as an example. This means by which strategic resource planning and control is exercised or may be controlled itself. And organisations often develop a process for review, planning and control using standard documents, reporting, monitoring and evaluation. And in some organisations, the process and outcomes may be subject to an audit. The use of a process can be established to assess if it's compliant with the process or non-compliant. And the effectiveness of resource strategic planning and control can be assessed, perhaps by the ability to meet the plan and the accuracy of the forecast. Now, loading is the volume of work undertaken or allocated by a stated resource. Any individual, a group of individuals, a department, a machine, a warehouse or a logistics facility. The principle of loading is directly linked to capacity and in many cases capability. A system or process may have designed loading capacity. This is an example you can see on the screen. Maximum loading is the maximum volume or amount that it is possible to undertake for the given period. Variable loading is if there are variations to processes or types of work undertaken. Finite loading is where managers place limits on work volumes or capacity, delaying or even declining work that exceeds those limits. And infinite loading is where there are no stated or designed in volumes or capacity limits. But this can result in delays, possible quality problems, and increased pressure from the staff involved. So the factors that affect loading include efficiency, effectiveness, training and experience, and the time available. The range of activities and repeats or the one-offs. And the monitoring of loading is often undertaken by the provision of appropriate data, creation of reporting and trend information. Targets may be established, but the reasons for out of range results need to be investigated so the causes can be potentially reduced or removed. The principle or need to prioritise activities and resources commitments is often inevitable because businesses tend to have finite resources. They may be insufficient finance to replace the equipment. You might have a volume limitation or supply side limitations, or you don't have the capability to employ extra staff in the short term. So organisations sometimes benefit from establishing normal rules to support the operational prioritisation of decisions. So these are the widely, I suppose, featured operational management texts. You've got earliest due date, EDD. This can easily prioritise customers that request specific dates and work can be scheduled sorting to the date of priority. The FIFO stands for first in, first out. Or you've got the first come, first serve, FCFS. And that's easy to manage as the processing order can be allocated on arrival. The SPT is the shortest processing time. This can be more awkward to administer as there may be similar orders that have the same time or a similar process. The LPT is the longest processing time. This can be particularly relevant when there are many delays expected in acquiring supplies or delays at the various stages, so it's better to start as early as possible to avoid missing your delivery requirements. The similar processing and setup is the prioritisation based around logic, that undertaking the same process or series of processes in a group of tasks takes less time than continually changing your processes or setting up different equipment. The HR skill requirement will allocate specific staff to orders that have got specialist skills. An equipment requirement is the prioritization which allocates equipment with specific capabilities to an order rather than allocating work to any equipment. Now, strategic planning is often undertaken or dominated by senior management in an organisation. Now, depending on the organisation, it is possible that an external, non-executive shareholder or trustee may also be directly involved in the decision-making and the monitoring of plans. Many organisations make staff aware of those strategic plans, particularly when these are integrating with operations. Some staff may have specific roles in strategic planning or implementation, and the three approaches to planning will include a sort of top-down, bottom-up and top-down, bottom-up. So we'll start with number one, the top-down. This is where there are high levels of management plans and they're making decisions and directing managers and staff to allocate resources in a specific way. And that could result in staff dissatisfaction as there's lack of involvement at the operational level. The bottom up is where operational staff and managers create their plans and inform, request or compete for their plans to be adopted and for those resources to be made available. So this can result in unrealistic requirements or a need to prioritise and coordinate, which may make some plans very difficult to enact. And the third one is top-down, bottom-up. This is where the general objective and direction are decided at senior management, but detailing and refinement contributions are made which may enhance the strategy and make implications and implementations more effective. So this may change the required collaboration internally across departments. You'll have the formations of teams from different departments that work on changes, as it's generally preferable to individual staff working on those changes. So an example might be a project to change your IT infrastructure. That's going to involve a team comprising high-level managers, IT staff, general staff, and a user representative, and even the supplier. Each would have a role and contribution to the planning and control of that project. Many staff have job descriptions that include requirements to contribute to some aspects of management and control. And some planning decisions may require the development of a range of options and an evaluation of the options against some criteria. So clearly this technique helps to lift recommendations or decisions away from simple options and it establishes a means for direct comparison of those options. In some cases, a planning group could provide proposals and feedback from the staff and managers formally before acceptance of those plans. So this consultation pattern may also be extended to suppliers or even customers, where changes proposed could affect the supply network members. But lower level decisions may be made by those planning or implementing a plan, and they perhaps don't have significant cost, time implications, or changes of objective. And referrals to senior managers would normally be expected where there is a significant deviation from the plan or the overall objective. Now, customers can be helpful in providing their interpretation of industry trends and forecasting demand. So having some sort of a routine interaction can reveal customer intentions and their strategic direction. But chance comments are not the basis for good planning. So an important customer could be planning the replacement of basic products with a higher spec. So you need to work with that customer on this change. It's not to assume that orders for the basic products will continue at the same level. And now a supply interface expectation is very similar. The changes and delays are not communicated inward to a supplier, and that means that the supplier cannot effectively manage the customer interface. So the supply interface and supplier relationships are affected by supplier strategies that you adopt. So the perpetual competitive bidding approach with short contract period is less likely to engage the work relationship that a partnership approach would need, despite the same opportunities for including liaison requirements in contract terms. Now, many decisions relating to strategic planning and control require some sort of cross-functional view and improvement of many staff from different parts of the organisation. So it's also possible that supply network participation involves a range of different functions. So here we can see some of the other business functions, both internal and external, involved in the contribution to planning. So you've got sales, their typical contribution will be targeting and planning and reporting, whereas purchasing will be looking at materials and products to support new sales figures. Finance looking at credit applications, cash flow, profit forecasts, billing and invoicing. The warehouse, planning increased storage or the number of stock movements. Support staff might see an increase in administration. Suppliers, involving them in negotiation, capacity, and after-sales support, increased activity extended like call centres. But in any organisation, some activities can be easily controlled, but others can be difficult to control. The ability to control operations can depend on the extent to which an organisation can influence operational capability, compliance, performance, capacity. The nature of the activity, the size and complexity of it. The force field diagram that you can see on the screen was created by Kurt Lewin, and that can be used to simplify complex and interrelated situations. So there are factors that positively influence and promote the changes that are needed, and factors that are negatively influencing, resisting, or suggesting that change isn't necessary. And there are various approaches to this. Some organisations or managers only use factual force. Others might include assumptions, opinions relating to the current or future situations. So the force field diagram can be based on the current situation, the overall proposed strategy, or concentrate on specific resources. Now they can be prepared at the start of the process and reviewed at the project when it develops, with the potential for more diverse and specific issues, replacing those which have never been resolved. There are many methods of control that can be used in a variety of business management situations. And managers will usually consider what needs to be controlled how it needs to be controlled, and how often monitoring is necessary. But it's also possible that resources for monitoring and control are needed. In general terms, control may be undertaken by restricting or providing resources, such as finance, staff, equipment, and stock, setting targets for KPIs and SLAs, action plans, prioritising activities, creating progress charts, maintaining and managing resource utilisation, costs, budgets, efficiency, effectiveness, as well as understanding barriers and potential causes of failure. So cost control, internally, costs are often controlled by monitoring budgets. Cost codes are frequently used to enable detailed analysis of the types of cost. And only authorised staff are permitted to authorise specific cost codes. And ultimately, payments from bank accounts can be authorised by specific officials. Now, your costs can be examined frequently to ensure that they are in budget. And budget reports are often created nowadays by accounting systems which highlight any under or over budget situations. These type of variance analysis are common techniques used to control the situation. So many organisations control cost via their purchase contracts, and the strategies could be looking at things like fixed price contracts, variable price contracts with notice or a cost maximum, linking cost to a national, international or industry index, open and transparent costs or gain share arrangements, or even looking at fixed exchange rates or dealing in only one currency. We've then got risk control, which is usually undertaken by a systematic approach, including risk assessments and risk registers. Risk is controlled by awareness. You're trying to either avoid the risk, eliminate the risk, reduce the impact of the risk, or transfer it to another organisation. The causes of operational failure. Many causes of errors or failures can be predicted, and managers and staff that are aware of the potential cause or failure are better placed to put control measures in place, like any additional checks or safeguards. Now, typical techniques seen in a variety of organisations come from quality management principles or ISO 9000. The cause and effect diagram, sometimes known as the fishbone, it looks at the fish skeleton without a head. And the analysis looks at the kind of things that are coming off that spine. Is the problem relating to demand, supplier issues, the centre, the company policy, the materials? And ultimately, you can link this to something called the 5 whys, where you try to get to the root cause of the problem. And then stock control has traditionally focused on the accuracy of records, physical control of stock to avoid any losses, the reduction of stock volume to reduce lower storage costs and lower value locked up in stock, assigning volumes with demand and availability, and trying to avoid a stock out situation, reducing lead times. Now, the principle can be applied to internal processes and external supply networks. This is the push and pull, but the push control method works on the principle that the output is pre-planned without any definitive matching demand. In some cases, this can be having a production or available resource that may not meet the real demand required. But in other cases, a surplus capacity or overproduction may be experienced, and plans are made to push out or allocate resources based on the resource available, but with uncertainty. This decision is correct, I suppose. So the push method is a method of operational planning based on forecast and demand, rather than working with orders for immediate requirements. The pull method can be applied to internal processes and external supply network situations. It normally works on the basis that demand is established through orders and instructions received, rather than the push technique. So it's a method of operationally planning, working or varying demand, experienced rather than pre-planned, of operational requirements based on forecasting. And most organisations attempt to meet a known demand, so the provision of adequate resources can then take place, although ultimately designed in system constraints and lead times for change, which may limit the ability of the organisation to meet its demand. Now, the theory of constraints, the drum, the buffer stocks, and the rope. So this principle suggests that there may be one or more points within the production or process which significantly limit the capability or capacity of an organisation to perform or improve its performance. So a constraint could be, for example, a lack of skills or the absence of a resource or a process itself. A constraint in the context of this theory may also have an external source. So the theory suggests that when identifying these constraints, it could be systematically worked on or continuously improved. So the bottleneck, the drum bottleneck, the buffer stock, and the rope, these terms are used for a series of concepts and a production planning technique that works with the known delay or hold-up point, which distributes the, or disrupts, should I say, the smoothness of the production flow, which ends up with a bottleneck. So if you're going to avoid building up a bottleneck point in the system, it's really important that all those involved are aware of the rate at which work is being processed. So the drum represents the communication about the speed or throughput through the system. The most important issue being the slowest activity or any activities that cause delays. So the second principle is if the completion time is required, then it may be missed owing to a bottleneck. So a buffer stock can be created by calculating the delays, rescheduling production to start earlier to ensure the item clears the bottleneck in time for finishing. And the third principle, the stages of production are linked with a theoretical rope, which represents the speed at which the flow should work to avoid delays and avoid surplus. Now, materials requirement planning, MRP, is a system based on the approach of planning, most often used in manufacturing or assembling. It's designed for dependent demand products, which are items that require multiple elements assembled on materials. So MRP requires many inputs in terms of files and information in order to produce accurate outputs like reports to support the business. You see things like the strategic plan, which have the expected orders, the live customer orders, any updated forecasts, production constraints, the master production schedule, the inventory files, which include the stock held on order and the lead times, the bill of materials, the output, the purchase orders, the reports, and the recommendation. And modern MRP systems tend to integrate information which may extend to receiving information from suppliers and customers from their databases of usage, sales, and stock. An MRP system's reporting may include the ability to create reports or alerts when you've got excess or short stock internally, and network predictions based on trend, and dead stock reports internally and across the network highlight opportunities to reduce or dispose of stock. And then MRPII is manufacturer resource planning. This is traditionally viewed as a software offering a bigger picture when planning production, because it considers the materials timescales already detailed in MRP, but the additional considerations of MRPII are the labour availability and capacity to process the work, as well as the machine availability. And then perhaps the natural development of MRP and MRPII was the link together more information and create a whole organisation view. So ERP software is to offer this capability, and it came from both new systems designed for general business use and comparable to software to handle interactions with other programs. So materials and manufacturer resources are just modules contributing to the whole package of an ERP system. And this ERP system can be established either with a single software package or a collection of compatible software packages. And the complexity of the organisation and any specialist situation determine the type of ERP system that you use. You know, some benefit from software specifically designed for an industry, and others are adopting software that's being used by many. So that is the end of Learning Outcome 3. Thank you very much for watching.